two fleets met in the Tsushima Strait, and within 2 days of maneuver and gunfire, the balance of power in East Asia was altered in ways that shaped the 20th century. At the turn of the century, Japan and Russia were locking horns over one clear strategic prize: control of warm water ports and influence on the Liaodong Peninsula. Japan, transformed by the Meiji Restoration, had spent decades rebuilding its state and military. Its leaders believed that naval power was essential to secure trade, defend the home islands, and project influence across Korea and Manchuria. Russia, meanwhile, driven by imperial ambition and a pressing need for year-round ports, pushed into the Far East, acquiring Port Arthur and expanding its presence on the Pacific coast. Those contradictory aims, one nation's drive to be a regional hegemon, the other's search for ports that did not freeze in winter, set the stage for a war in which the sea would be decisive. Naval power in 1904 had come to mean capital ships, armored cruisers, and the doctrine that battleships, properly employed, would determine the outcomes of wars at sea. Yet the Russo-Japanese War exposed something more complex. Doctrine, logistics, technology, and seamanship, working together, or failing to, could change outcomes as much as raw numbers of guns and armor. The first shots were not a formal declaration, but a prelude. In February 1904, Japanese torpedo boats struck Port Arthur in a surprise attack. That action and the subsequent months of siege and sorties made clear that modern naval war would combine gunnery, torpedoes, mines, and, increasingly, the new capability of wireless communication. The siege of Port Arthur was bitter and protracted. Admiral Stepan Makarov, who took command of the Russian Pacific forces in early 1904, pushed for more aggressive operations and better coordination. His death in April 1904, when the battleship Petropavlovsk struck a mine, was a crippling blow to Russian morale and command cohesion. His successor, Admiral Wilhelm Wittfeft, would lead the fleet in an attempt to break out in August 1904 at the Battle of the Yellow Sea. Wittfeft was killed in that engagement, and the Pacific Squadron failed to force a decisive shift. By winter, the Japanese capture of Port Arthur on January 2, 1905, had further eroded Russian options in the theater. Unable to reverse the situation with local forces, the Tsarist government made a dramatic and risky choice. Russia dispatched a second, larger force from the Baltic. This Second Pacific Squadron, assembled and placed under Admiral Zinovy Rozhestovsky, set off in late 1904 on what would become one of the longest naval voyages in history. The fleet steamed out of the Baltic, transited the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, crossed the Indian Ocean, and threaded through Southeast Asian waters toward the East China Sea.
Along the way, the fleet suffered more than the ordinary wear of distance. Ships required constant coaling and maintenance, machinery was strained, and crews faced illness and exhaustion. Many vessels were older or poorly suited to sustained high-speed operations. Spare parts and proper dockyard refits were limited. By the time the squadron approached Japanese waters in May 1905, its material condition and morale had been significantly degraded. Japan, on the other hand, benefited from shorter lines of communication and a navy increasingly drilled in modern gunnery and fleet maneuvers. Admiral Togo Hihachido, commanding the combined fleet, had at his disposal modern battleships like Mikasa, well-maintained, well-trained crews, and a doctrine emphasizing speed, coordinated fire, and tactical flexibility. Crucially, the Japanese had invested in wireless telegraphy and in procedures to exploit it. Wireless would not win the battle by itself, but it improved situational awareness. Japanese stations and ships intercepted notices, coordinated patrols, and relayed sightings that let Togo position his forces before contact. To understand how Tsushima unfolded, it helps to set out the fleets in comparative terms, without losing sight of the human judgment and technological details that mattered. Rozhestovsky's fleet was sizable and included dreadnought-era capital ships of varying ages, armored cruisers, and destroyers, but it was a mixed collection drawn from a stretched empire. Togo's force, while numerically comparable in some categories, was tactically superior: faster ships, better trained gunnery, and tighter command communications. Where Russia relied on the assumption that sheer weight of metal could carry the day, Japan emphasized maneuver, rate of fire, and the ability to concentrate broadside salvos at effective ranges. On the morning of May 27, 1905, reconnaissance and wireless reports alerted Togo that Rozhestovsky's squadron had been located crossing toward the Korean Strait. What followed was a precisely executed series of maneuvers and engagements across 2 days, May 27 and 28, that combined long-range gunnery, decisive closing actions, and night attacks that prevented an effective Russian regrouping. The decisive maneuver of the battle was a classic naval tactic known as crossing the T. In simple terms, imagine 2 columns of ships traveling roughly parallel. The fleet that forms a line across the front of the enemy can bring all its broadside guns to bear down the length of the enemy column, while the enemy, aligned bow on, can only reply with forward guns of far smaller weight. Crossing the T concentrated Japanese firepower while denying the Russians free broadsides in return. Togo achieved that tactical advantage through a combination of speed, screening cruisers, and repeated course changes that confused and fragmented the Russian formations.
The first day featured long-range exchanges in which Japanese gunnery began to exact a toll. Russian ships like Oslabya and Retvizon were heavily hit. Oslabya foundered under the pounding and sank early in the engagement, one of the first major losses. Retvizon fought on but suffered severe damage and was later scuttled or captured, depending on the stage of the action. Cesarewitch and other battleships were left crippled and increasingly isolated. Mikasa, under Togo's command, coordinated series of attacks that emphasized concentration of fire on key Russian units to break the enemy's cohesion. Nightfall did not end the pressure. Rather, it opened a new, more dangerous phase. Japanese destroyers and torpedo boats, operating in the dark and guided by reconnaissance and signals intelligence, attacked the scattered Russian remnants. Torpedo attacks in the narrow waters and the confusion of night multiplied the losses and limited the ability of the Russian captains to reform a coherent defensive line. Wireless telegraphy, still in its infancy as a military tool, played a role in both detection and coordination. Japanese stations picked up Russian transmissions and relayed positions. Togo used that information to time his attacks and to close with individual enemy elements. Wireless did not replace eyes and seamanship, but it magnified the Japanese Navy's ability to act on information quickly. Sobering numbers help to convey the battle's scale, though contemporary accounts vary. Reported Russian losses at Tsushima include the sinking or capture of most of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, roughly 24 ships across battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and several thousand personnel killed or taken prisoner. Japanese losses were far smaller in comparison, though not negligible. These figures are reported based on contemporary sources and remain the subject of detailed archival work. They should be treated as approximate where sources differ. The immediate consequence was unambiguous. Russia's ability to contest Japanese control of the sea was effectively destroyed. The human cost and the material destruction were only part of the impact. Tsushima's political and diplomatic repercussions were swift. Facing the collapse of its Pacific naval presence and fearing further disasters, the Russian government accelerated efforts to negotiate. The defeat at Tsushima intensified existing domestic pressures inside Russia, economic strain, political unrest, and popular dissatisfaction, contributing to the climate that led to the 1905 revolution and to a broader questioning of imperial strategy. Internationally, the result forced Russia to accept mediated peace. The subsequent Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt and signed in September 1905, confirmed Japanese gains in Korea and southern Sakhalin and marked Japan's formal recognition as a major regional power. Why did Tsushima reverberate so widely? There are several linked reasons. First, it was the first time in the modern era that an Asian power defeated a major European navy in a set-piece battle. That outcome challenged prevailing assumptions about the balance between European and Asian powers and raised Japan's international standing. Second, the battle revealed that naval warfare was entering a new phase. Wireless telegraphy, improved gunnery accuracy, higher sustained rates of fire, and coordinated use of smaller, fast craft like destroyers and torpedo boats could multiply the effectiveness of a fleet that combined those elements well. Third, logistics and maintenance proved decisive. Rozhetsky's fleet suffered for lack of proper refit opportunities and for the accumulated wear of an epic voyage. Crews were exhausted and machinery taxed. Tsushima demonstrated that numbers alone, ship counts and nominal tonnage, could be neutralized by better readiness, training, and command cohesion. The battle also carried a doctrinal lesson. At the time, many navies still placed faith in massive armored ships as the ultimate arbiter of naval power. Tsushima did not invalidate the importance of capital ships, but it showed that tactical innovation, fire control, speed, and the integration of supporting craft and technology could determine their effectiveness. In that sense, Tsushima was at once a last great victory for the pre-air, pre-submarine battleship era and a harbinger of things to come. Future naval planners would take note that concentrated gunnery practice, wireless coordination, and flexible tactics mattered at least as much as displacement and armor thickness. There were also legal and reputational consequences. The surrender of so many Russian sailors and ships produced international headlines and a crisis of confidence among Russia's ruling elite. In Japan, the victory fueled national pride and validated the Meiji leadership's program of modernization, strengthening the country's ability to pursue diplomatic and economic objectives across East Asia. Yet it would be misleading to present Tsushima as a single deterministic cause of later global conflicts or political developments. It was catalytic, a clear and decisive event that reshaped regional dynamics and accelerated trends that had been building for decades. It did not make World War I inevitable, but it did change the perception of where power lay in Asia and highlighted how rapidly technology and logistics could reorder military advantage. The battle's tactical episodes remain studied for their clarity. Togo's repeated ability to cross the T and to concentrate fire on isolated Russian units is taught in naval academies as an example of how speed and maneuver create opportunities for decisive action. The use of destroyers to hunt and torpedo crippled or isolated ships at night demonstrated how smaller platforms could finish what heavy guns began.
Equally instructive was how Rozhdestvensky's long voyage exposed his ships to mechanical strain, and how that attrition in peacetime geriatric conditions left the fleet vulnerable at the decisive moment. In assessing the larger implications, consider three interconnected lessons. First, national strategy must align with operational logistics. Projecting power across vast oceans required supply chains, coaling rights, and maintenance capabilities, areas where Russia was overmatched by distance. Second, technology and training matter. Wireless telegraphy and rigorous gunnery training allowed Japan to exploit information and concentrate lethal fires more effectively. Third, psychology and prestige shaped diplomacy. Tsushima's shock to Russian prestige catalyzed political consequences at home and altered how other great powers regarded Japan's place in the international order. For viewers interested in more detail, the story does not end with guns silenced in the Tsushima Strait. The immediate diplomatic fallout led to the Treaty of Portsmouth and to a reshaping of spheres of influence in East Asia that would echo through the decades. The war also accelerated naval design debates in Europe and Japan, influencing how ships were armed, how fleets trained, and how navies prepared for the new century's possibilities, aircraft and submarines yet to come, but already anticipated by forward thinkers. If this examination of Tsushima and its consequences resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and check out our extended podcast series, where we unpack the voyage of the Baltic Squadron in full detail, each stop, each logistical crisis, and the ship-by-ship accounts of what happened before those 2 decisive days in the Tsushima Strait. This episode is supported by World of Warships. If you enjoy naval history and want to experience fleet actions from different eras, check the link in the description, clearly marked as sponsor content and separate from our historical analysis. In short, Tsushima changed history because it combined immediate, crushing military defeat for one empire with political and diplomatic consequences that accelerated a regional realignment. It proved that a modern navy's effectiveness depended not only on armored displacement and the number of guns, but on the quality of training, the integration of emerging technologies like wireless telegraphy, and the hard realities of logistics and maintenance. The battle announced Japan's arrival as a major power, diminished Russian prestige, and gave naval thinkers a new case study in the interplay between doctrine, technology, and operational readiness. If you want a deep, episode-by-episode breakdown of the voyage from the Baltic to Asia, the ship logs and contemporary reports that document losses and captures, listen to the full 2-part podcast linked below.
If you found this useful, subscribe, leave a comment with what aspect you'd like us to cover next: ship engineering, the night torpedo attacks, or the diplomatic aftermath, and consider supporting the series via the merch or Patreon links in the description.